Good evening. Tonight we begin with a development connected to one of the most closely watched regions in the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. That region is Crimea. Crimea sits on the northern coast of the Black Sea. It has been at the center of geopolitical attention since Russia took control of the peninsula in 2014. Since that moment, Ukraine has repeatedly stated that Crimea remains part of its sovereign territory. And for years now, the question surrounding Crimea has remained one of the most sensitive issues in the broader conflict. Tonight's focus begins with a phrase that carries weight across diplomatic, military, and political conversations. Ukraine has made what is being described as a first move toward the liberation of Crimea. Now, when people hear the words first move, it can sound dramatic. But in reality, what it represents is the beginning of a process. A process involving political messaging, strategic positioning, and the continuing effort by Ukraine to restore control over territory it considers its own. Ukraine has consistently described Crimea as Ukrainian land. That position has been repeated in speeches, official documents, and international discussions. From Kyiv's perspective, the status of Crimea has never changed. It is considered temporarily occupied territory. And because of that position, Ukrainian leaders have repeatedly stated that restoring control over Crimea remains an objective. Crimea is not just a geographic point on the map. It is a peninsula that carries historical, strategic, and political importance. The Black Sea surrounds it on three sides. Ports located there play an important role in regional trade and naval movement. Control of Crimea affects access to the Black Sea and influences security dynamics across the region. These realities are part of why Crimea remains central to the conversation about Ukraine's territorial integrity. For Ukraine, the idea of liberation is tied directly to sovereignty. Sovereignty in this sense means restoring authority over land internationally recognized as part of Ukraine. That recognition is reflected in international statements and diplomatic positions held by many countries. But the situation on the ground has remained complicated since 2014. Russia maintains control over Crimea, Ukraine maintains its claim to the territory, and the international community continues to observe the situation closely. That is the background against which Ukraine's reported first move toward Crimea's liberation is now being discussed. It is being described as an early step, a signal, a moment that places Crimea back at the center of the broader conflict. Sometimes in international affairs, a single step can carry meaning far beyond the action itself. Because steps like these are not just about immediate outcomes, they are also about direction. They show where a government intends to move. They show what priorities remain unchanged. And for Ukraine, Crimea has always remained part of that priority. Officials in Kyiv have repeatedly emphasized that the country seeks the restoration of its territorial integrity. That phrase appears frequently in official Ukrainian statements. Territorial integrity means the restoration of internationally recognized borders. Crimea falls within those borders. And because of that, Ukraine's position has remained consistent. Crimea is Ukraine. That statement has appeared in speeches and public messaging over the years. It reflects a national commitment to the idea that the peninsula's future remains tied to Ukraine. Tonight's development, the first move toward liberation, signals that the question of Crimea remains active. It has not faded into the background of international attention. It remains a subject of strategic importance. It remains a subject of national importance. And it remains a subject that continues to shape the direction of Ukraine's actions. There is a simple line that captures the emotional weight behind moments like this. Sometimes the first step is quiet, but it carries the weight of a nation. That sentiment reflects the significance attached to Crimea in Ukraine's national narrative. For Ukraine, the peninsula represents more than territory. It represents sovereignty, it represents identity, and it represents a future that Ukrainian leaders believe must include the restoration of Crimea. The first move toward liberation is being discussed in that broader context, a context shaped by years of conflict, years of political statements, years of diplomatic engagement, and years of determination from Ukraine to maintain its claim. As we continue tonight, we will look more closely at how Crimea became such a central issue in this conflict and how Ukraine's position on the peninsula has remained consistent through the years. because understanding the significance of this first move requires understanding the long path that led to it. When we continue looking at Ukraine's first move toward the liberation of Crimea, it becomes clear that the peninsula has remained central to Ukraine's national position for many years. Crimea is not simply another region discussed in political debates. It is a place whose status has shaped conversations across governments, international organizations, and diplomatic forums since 2014. That year marked the moment when Russia took control of the peninsula. Since then, Ukraine has repeatedly described Crimea as territory that remains part of Ukraine under international law. This position has been repeated in official statements from Ukrainian leadership. It has also been echoed in discussions involving Ukraine's partners and diplomatic allies. For Ukraine, Crimea is considered temporarily occupied territory. That phrase appears frequently in official Ukrainian messaging. It reflects the government's view that the peninsula remains Ukrainian land, despite the current control exercised by Russia. And because of that view, Ukraine has maintained a consistent message: Crimea will return. You know, when governments repeat a message over many years, that message becomes part of the nation's political identity. In Ukraine's case, the status of Crimea has become one of those defining elements. The government in Kyiv continues to state that restoring territorial integrity is a national goal. Territorial integrity means that Ukraine's borders, as recognized internationally, must be restored. Crimea falls within those borders. And so the conversation about Crimea never truly disappears. It remains present in diplomatic discussions. It remains present in international forums. It remains present in Ukrainian public life. The first move toward Crimea's liberation is therefore not appearing in isolation. It is emerging within a context that has existed for nearly a decade, a context defined by Ukraine's consistent position on sovereignty and by Russia's continued control of the peninsula. This dynamic creates a situation in which Crimea stands as both a symbol and a strategic location. Symbolically, Crimea represents Ukraine's claim to its territorial rights. Strategically, Crimea holds significance because of its position along the Black Sea. The peninsula contains important naval facilities and ports. Control over these areas influences maritime activity in the region. Access to the Black Sea carries economic and security implications for countries in the surrounding area. These factors explain why Crimea remains so central to the larger conflict. But Ukraine's emphasis on the peninsula is not framed solely in strategic language. It is also framed through the lens of national identity and sovereignty. Ukraine's leadership continues to emphasize that Crimea belongs to Ukraine. That statement is not presented as a negotiation point. It is presented as a declaration of principle. Sometimes when listening to these discussions, you can hear the emotional tone behind the words, not anger, not theatrical rhetoric, but something quieter, something rooted in the belief that national borders matter, that sovereignty matters, that the identity of a country includes the land it calls its own. There is a line that reflects that sentiment in a simple way. A country remembers every piece of the ground it calls home. That line captures why Crimea continues to appear at the center of Ukraine's national message. Even after years of conflict, the government's position has not shifted. Crimea is Ukraine. And the goal of restoring control over the peninsula remains part of Ukraine's broader effort to restore territorial integrity. Ukraine's first move toward the liberation of Crimea is now being discussed in that context, not as an isolated event, but as part of a long-standing national position. It signals that Crimea remains on Ukraine's agenda. It signals that the government continues to pursue the restoration of control over the peninsula. And it signals that the conversation about Crimea is entering a new phase. You know, in international politics, certain places become symbols of larger struggles. Berlin once represented the divide between East and West. Other cities and regions have carried similar symbolic weight. In this conflict, Crimea has taken on that role. It represents sovereignty, it represents territorial integrity, and it represents the ongoing disagreement between Ukraine and Russia over the status of the peninsula. That disagreement continues to influence diplomatic conversations and international discussions. Countries around the world continue to monitor developments involving Crimea. International organizations continue to address the issue in statements and resolutions. And Ukraine continues to emphasize that Crimea remains an integral part of its national territory. The first move toward liberation now places Crimea back at the center of the international conversation. A reminder that the question of Crimea has never been resolved and that Ukraine continues to pursue the restoration of its territorial integrity. In the final part of our discussion tonight, we will examine how this first move toward Crimea's liberation reflects Ukraine's long-term commitment to reclaiming its land and what it represents for the country's ongoing struggle for sovereignty. As we arrive at the final part of this discussion tonight, the focus returns to the significance of the first move Ukraine has made toward the liberation of Crimea. By itself, a first step can appear modest. It may not immediately change the situation on the ground, but in international affairs, first steps carry meaning far beyond the moment in which they occur. They signal direction, they communicate intent, and they remind the world that certain questions remain unresolved. For Ukraine, Crimea represents one of those questions. Since 2014, the Ukrainian government has consistently stated that the peninsula remains part of Ukraine's sovereign territory. That statement has appeared in official speeches, diplomatic communications, and international discussions. Ukraine has maintained that its internationally recognized borders include Crimea. And because of that, the government's position has remained clear. Crimea is Ukraine. Those words appear repeatedly in Ukrainian public messaging. They are short, they are direct, and they carry the weight of a national commitment. The first move toward the liberation of Crimea now becomes part of that larger commitment. It reflects Ukraine's continued determination to restore control over territory it considers its own. You know, when a country holds to the same position over many years, that consistency becomes part of its national identity. In Ukraine's case, the question of Crimea has remained present through every stage of the conflict. It has been raised in diplomatic negotiations. It has been addressed in international forums. And it has been emphasized in the language used by Ukrainian officials. That message has remained steady. Crimea remains Ukrainian territory. Because of that position, the first move toward liberation carries symbolic importance. It signals that Ukraine's commitment to territorial integrity has not changed. It signals that Crimea remains part of the country's long-term national vision. And it signals that Ukraine continues to pursue the restoration of its borders. Sometimes the most important moments in international politics are not dramatic. They are quiet. They are measured. They take place within the language of official statements and national commitments. But even quiet moments can carry deep meaning. There is a line that captures that feeling. Some promises are carried year after year until the day they are fulfilled. That sentiment reflects how Crimea appears within Ukraine's national conversation. For Ukraine, Crimea is not simply a point on a map. It is part of the country's identity. It is part of the country's territory, and it remains part of the country's future vision. The first move toward liberation is therefore connected to a broader principle, the principle of sovereignty. Sovereignty means that a country has authority over its own territory and its own decisions. Ukraine has consistently stated that Crimea falls within that authority. That claim has remained unchanged since Russia took control of the peninsula in 2014, and because of that, Crimea remains a central element of Ukraine's national message. Throughout the years since 2014, the government in Kyiv has emphasized the importance of restoring territorial integrity. Territorial integrity refers to the restoration of internationally recognized borders. Those borders include Crimea, and that fact continues to shape Ukraine's approach to the conflict. The first move toward Crimea's liberation now highlights that long-standing position. It places the peninsula back into the spotlight of international attention. It reminds observers that the question of Crimea remains unresolved, and it reinforces Ukraine's commitment to reclaiming its territory. Across diplomatic conversations and international discussions, the future of Crimea continues to be closely watched. Governments, analysts, and organizations observe developments related to the peninsula. The issue carries strategic importance because of Crimea's location in the Black Sea, but it also carries symbolic importance because of what the peninsula represents for Ukraine: national identity, territorial sovereignty, and the belief that the country's borders should be restored. You know, sometimes the meaning of a moment becomes clearer when you step back and look at the years that came before it. Ukraine's first move toward Crimea's liberation is not the beginning of Ukraine's claim. That claim has existed for years. Instead, this moment serves as a reminder that the claim remains active, that the commitment remains present, and that the vision of restoring Ukraine's territorial integrity continues to guide the country's actions. For Ukraine, Crimea is more than a region. It is part of the country's identity and sovereignty. And the first move toward liberation reflects a determination that has remained unchanged through years of conflict and international attention. Tonight's discussion began with a simple phrase: Ukraine makes its first move toward Crimea's liberation. Behind that phrase lies years of commitment, years of national messaging, and a continuing effort by Ukraine to restore control over the land it calls its own.